Every morning, Lena Johnson pressed her daughter's school uniform with a small iron balanced on the bathroom counter, because there was no room for it anywhere else. On a cold Monday morning in October, 8-year-old Amara walked through the iron gates of the most prestigious private school in the city, the same way she had every single day that year. One by one, every other child walked through the doors, and Amara was left outside, alone. What no one knew, not the parents, not the staff, not the woman who had engineered the whole thing, was that the quiet man watching from across the street carried a secret that would change everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The cold hit differently on Monday mornings. There was something about the way October air settled over the city before the sun had fully committed to rising. Thin and sharp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and car exhaust, and something almost metallic that made your cheeks sting if you stood still long enough. Amara Johnson had learned this about Monday mornings. She had learned it the way children learn things they can't explain to adults. Not with words, but with the particular tension in her shoulders every time she stepped off the bus and looked down the long tree-lined block toward Ridgewood Academy. The school was beautiful. That was the honest truth of it, and Amara had never pretended otherwise. 3 stories of pale limestone with tall arched windows and ivy crawling up the eastern wall, iron gates that gleamed even on gray mornings, and a wide circular courtyard where parents gathered to drop off their children in cars that probably cost more than the apartment building where Amara lived. She had noticed these things from her very first day, the same way she noticed everything, quietly, carefully filing the observations away somewhere behind her eyes. She was 8 years old, and she was already very good at being quiet. This particular Monday, she wore her Navy school uniform, the one her mother had pressed carefully the night before with the small iron they kept on the bathroom counter because there was no room anywhere else. The collar was a little frayed at one edge, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Amara knew without being told that some of the other mothers had noticed. She carried her blue lunchbox in one hand and her backpack on both shoulders because the zipper on the right strap had started pulling loose and her mother had safety pinned it, and if she only used one shoulder, the pin would dig into her arm. None of this bothered her especially. She liked school. She liked it more than almost anything. The way numbers arranged themselves into patterns if you stared at them long enough, the smell of the science room, the particular satisfaction of a completed worksheet where every answer was correct. She liked her teacher, Mrs. Clark, who had once kept Amara after class, not because she was in trouble, but because she wanted to show her a book about bridges and structural engineering that she'd ordered specifically because Amara had mentioned once that she dreamed of building things. That was the school she was walking toward. That was why she got up every morning and pressed her uniform and packed her lunchbox and walked to the bus stop while it was still dark. The courtyard was its usual Monday morning chaos when she arrived. Luxury sedans and SUVs queued along the curved driveway, releasing children in crisp uniforms who bounded toward the entrance without a second look at their parents. Fathers in business suits checked their phones while mothers exchanged the particular kind of pleasantries that sounded warm but communicated status. Amara slipped through the gathered parents the way water moves around stones, finding the gaps, keeping her head down just enough to avoid eye contact without being rude about it. She reached the entrance a few steps behind Tyler Whitmore and his twin sister Cassidy, who were being walked in by their au pair. The front doors were propped open, warm light and the smell of floor wax and chalk spilling out into the cold morning. The young woman at the welcome table, a staff member named Ms. Pratt who had worked the front entrance all year and who always wore her auburn hair in the same tight bun, smiled at Tyler and Cassidy and waved them through. Then Amara stepped up. Ms. Pratt's smile flickered. It didn't disappear entirely. It just changed shape, becoming something more careful, more deliberate. She glanced down at a clipboard she was holding, then back up at Amara, then at the clipboard again. "Amara Johnson?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt much longer. Behind Amara, another family was waiting to enter. Ms. Pratt's eyes moved to them, and then back to Amara with the particular look of someone who wishes a problem would solve itself. "Sweetie," I'm going to need you to wait out here for just a moment. Amara blinked. Wait out here? Yes. There's an administrative matter that needs to be sorted out. Principal Whitaker will be down to speak with you shortly. She said it quietly, leaning forward slightly, as if lowering her voice made the words less strange. But class starts in 10 minutes, Amara said. I know, honey. Just wait right over there on the steps, okay? It'll be sorted out very quickly. Amara looked at the steps. They were stone and they looked cold. She looked back at Ms. Pratt, but Ms. Pratt had already pivoted toward the family behind her, greeting them with a full, natural smile, waving them past. And just like that, Amara was no longer in the line of people being welcomed. She was simply standing to one side while the morning moved on without her. She went and sat on the steps. She placed her lunchbox on the step beside her and adjusted her backpack and sat very straight, the way her mother always told her to sit when she was somewhere important, because how you carry yourself tells people who you are before you ever open your mouth. That was something Lena Johnson said often enough that Amara had memorized it. She sat straight and she watched the last few children file through the entrance, and she waited. The doors closed at 8:15. The courtyard, which had been loud and full of movement just minutes before, went silent almost immediately. The cars had pulled away. The parents were gone. The staff member who had been directing traffic near the driveway had stepped back inside. The iron gates were still open, technically, but there was no one left to walk through them. No one except Amara, who was still on the steps. She looked at the closed front doors for a long time. Everyone got into class, she thought. Except me. She said it quietly out loud, just to herself, just to test how it sounded. It sounded wrong. It sounded like the kind of sentence that shouldn't exist, the kind you hear in a dream where the rules of things have shifted slightly without explanation. She had not been in trouble. She had not forgotten anything. She had arrived on time, in her uniform, with her lunchbox and her backpack, and all her homework completed. She had done everything exactly right. She pulled her knees up slightly against the cold and hugged her backpack to her chest. She was not going to cry. She had decided this clearly and deliberately in the first 2 minutes of sitting there, the same way she decided things about math problems. Figure out what you know, figure out what you don't know, hold steady until more information arrives. She was going to sit quietly, and she was going to wait, and eventually someone was going to come out and explain what administrative matter needed to be sorted. And it was going to be something simple, something that would be fixed in 5 minutes, and she would walk into class with maybe just a small delay. She told herself this for about 10 minutes before the trembling started. It wasn't the cold exactly, although the cold didn't help. It was the particular combination of being alone and being confused and trying very hard to be brave. That combination produces a specific physical response in children, a kind of internal shaking that starts somewhere in the chest and eventually shows up in the hands. Amara pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed carefully and stared at a crack in the stone step between her feet. It's going to be fine, she told herself. It's going to be fine. She did not call her mother. She had thought about it once, just briefly, the way you think about something you already know you won't do. The girl hadn't moved except to pull her backpack closer against her chest. No adult had come out to check on her. The parents who had dropped off their children were long gone. The courtyard was empty. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his seat. He had built a company from a basement in his late 20s. He had negotiated with foreign governments and navigated hostile board takeovers and sat across tables from people who were trying to destroy everything he'd built. He had developed, over the years, a very precise ability to recognize when a situation that looked small was actually important, when what appeared to be an administrative inconvenience was in fact a signal of something structural, something wrong at the foundation. The girl on the steps was not an administrative inconvenience. He could see it even from across the street. The way she was sitting, the way she kept looking at the doors, the way she was trying, with everything she had, not to fall apart. He sat with it for another 5 minutes, giving the school one final opportunity to correct itself. No one came out. He opened the door and stepped onto the street. The cold registered immediately. He crossed without hurrying, nodded to his driver who had straightened reflexively, and walked through the open iron gates into the courtyard. The girl looked up when she heard footsteps, and for a fraction of a second her face opened with hope before she understood he was a stranger and pulled back into composure. She wiped her eyes quickly. She had been crying, not loudly, barely at all, just the silent overflow that happens when you've been holding yourself together for too long. He pretended not to notice, not to make her feel exposed. He stopped a few feet away and lowered himself slightly, a partial crouch, bringing his eye level closer to hers, so that she wasn't looking up at a tall stranger looming over her. "Why aren't you in class?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not demanding, just asking. She looked at him for a moment, deciding something. Then, "They said I can't go in." Her voice trembled very slightly at the edges. But everyone else did. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't performing distress. She was simply reporting what had happened, and the plainness of it, the genuine confusion of a child who had done nothing wrong and couldn't understand why that wasn't enough, landed somewhere in Daniel's chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Do you know why?" he asked. "They said there's an administrative matter." She said the phrase carefully, the way children repeat unfamiliar words, accurately, because she remembered it exactly, but with the slight distance of something borrowed from the adult world. He straightened up. "Stay here a moment," he said, which was perhaps a strange thing to say to someone who had been stuck there for nearly half an hour already. But she nodded seriously, as if it were useful instruction. He walked to the entrance. The staff member at the welcome table, different from the one who had been there before, an older woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked up as he pushed through the door. "Good morning," Daniel said pleasantly. "I'm here for 9 o'clock with the board. But I also wanted to ask," the girl outside on the steps, "can you tell me why she hasn't been allowed into school this morning?" The woman's expression shifted through several things quickly. Recognition that he was a visitor, the managed courtesy that came with that, then a flicker of something uncomfortable. "That's an enrollment matter," she said carefully. "The principal is handling it." "What kind of enrollment matter?" I'm not the right person to speak to about that." She gestured toward an interior corridor. "I can let Principal Whitaker know you're here." "Please do," Daniel said. He returned to Amara while he waited. She was still sitting exactly where he'd left her. He sat down on the step beside her, which seemed to surprise her slightly. The seat of his suit trousers touching cold stone didn't appear to concern him at all. "They're going to speak with the principal," he told her. She nodded. "Okay." A few parents who had arrived late were walking past the courtyard now, slowing as they noticed the girl and the suited man on the steps. One mother hesitated and approached a staff member who had come outside to direct a late arrival, and Daniel caught the tail end of the exchange. "Why is that child still outside?" Before the staff member replied in a lowered voice, and the mother moved on with a troubled expression. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. Amara. "What grade are you in?" "Third." "You like school?" She looked at him. It was a direct look, the kind that children give when they're deciding whether a question deserves a real answer or a polite one. "Yes," she said finally. "I really like it. I like the science room especially. There's a model of a suspension bridge that Mrs. Clark lets me work on during free period." Principal Harold Whitaker was a man who had spent 22 years becoming very good at managing impressions. He was trim and silver-haired, dressed in the kind of navy blazer with a pocket square that communicated authority without aggression. His office smelled of coffee and wood polish, and everything on his desk was arranged to suggest order. Stacked files, a framed photograph of the school's last graduation, a small crystal award from the Regional Private School Association. He had the handshake of someone who had attended seminars on handshakes and the smile of someone who practiced it. When Daniel was shown in, Whitaker stood and extended that handshake with the particular warmth of a man greeting someone he needed something from. "Mr. Carter, welcome to Ridgewood. We're very much looking forward to our conversation today." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Daniel sat. He did not smile the way Whitaker was smiling. "Thank you. Before we get to the 9 o'clock agenda, I'd like to understand something." The girl outside. "Amara Johnson, what's the situation?" A brief pause. Whitaker settled back into his chair with a careful adjustment of expression, the warm welcome recalibrating into something more measured, more professional. "That's an enrollment matter," he said. "An unfortunate administrative situation that we're working to resolve." "She's been sitting on your front steps for 40 minutes, Daniel said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact, stated in the same neutral tone that made it somehow more pointed than anger would have been. Whitaker cleared his throat. There's a question surrounding the scholarship placement that allowed Amara to attend Ridgewood. Her family does not pay full tuition. She was admitted through our financial aid program, based on academic testing. And there have been some. He paused, selecting his word. Concerns raised by members of our donor community regarding the scope of that program. What kind of concerns? Another careful pause. Some of our most significant contributors feel that the scholarship program, as currently structured, doesn't align with the direction they'd like to see the school take. Daniel let this sit in the air between them for a moment. A wealthy private school, he said slowly, is refusing entry to an 8-year-old child because some donors don't like the scholarship program. I understand how that sounds. I'd like you to explain the financial issue specifically. Whitaker folded his hands on the desk. Amara's scholarship is under review. Her family was notified by letter last week that there were compliance questions regarding the documentation supporting her placement. Was she told she couldn't come to school today? She was told the matter needed to be resolved before her enrollment could be confirmed for this academic term. She's been at this school all year, Daniel said. Yes. And she arrived this morning in uniform, on time, with her materials. Yes. And you sat her outside on the steps. Whitaker's jaw tightened slightly. He picked up a pen and set it down again. Mr. Carter, I want to be transparent with you, given the nature of today's intended discussion. There are certain pressures within our donor structure that make these decisions very complicated. I don't make them in a vacuum. Who is applying the pressure? There was a silence. Whitaker turned slightly toward the window. There's a parent, a board-adjacent donor, who has been particularly vocal about the direction of the admissions program. She believes the scholarship cohort should be significantly reduced. Her family's contributions represent a meaningful portion of our annual operating budget. Her name, Whitaker hesitated. Then, Evelyn Harrington. The name meant nothing to Daniel yet, but he stored it. And the school's response to this donor's preferences was to leave a child outside in the cold. The situation is more nuanced than, where is Amara's mother? She was called. She works at a hospital. She can't come until later in the afternoon. Daniel stood up. I'm going to step outside and check on the girl. I'd like to continue this conversation in a few minutes. He said it politely, as if offering Whitaker a courtesy, though both of them understood it was something else. Amara had taken a small notebook from her backpack while he'd been inside. Daniel paused when he saw it. She was bent over it with a pencil, writing something that required concentration, her brow furrowed in the particular way of someone doing mental work. He approached and looked over her shoulder before she noticed him. Numbers, not words. A long sequence of calculations spilling down the page in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. You brought homework to sit on the steps? He said. She looked up quickly. I didn't want to fall behind, she said, and there was no self-pity in it, just the matter-of-fact logic of someone who had decided how to spend available time efficiently. He sat down beside her again. What are you working on? She showed him the notebook. It was not third-grade work. He had enough mathematical background to recognize that immediately. The problem she was working through involved a pattern sequence that would typically appear in 5th or 6th grade at the earliest, and possibly not until middle school, depending on the curriculum. She had written the pattern, identified the underlying rule, extended the sequence, and was now working on a proof-style explanation of why the rule held. Where did you get this problem? He asked. I made it up, she said. Well, I saw a simpler one in a book, and I wanted to see what happened if I changed one of the conditions. She pointed to a line in the middle of the page. It got more complicated, but I think the same rule still works. I'm trying to show why. Daniel looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then, what do you want to be when you grow up? An engineer, she said immediately. A structural engineer. I want to design bridges. Or buildings. Things that hold things up. She said this without any of the tentativeness children sometimes use for big dreams, as if she was worried they sound foolish. She said the way she said everything, plainly and precisely, as a fact. Ridgewood has a good science program, he asked. The best one in the city for my grade level, she said. There are 2 real engineers who come and teach special classes on Thursdays. and they have a 3D printer in the lab. She looked down at her notebook. I was supposed to have my first session with the 3D printer today. Third period. She said it quietly, with no particular drama, but the weight of it landed clearly. Daniel took out his phone and sent a short message to his assistant. Research Ridgewood Academy board structure. All donor relationships. Board meeting schedule. Scholarship program details. Everything you can find in the next 30 minutes. He slipped the phone back in his pocket. Your mother is coming later? He asked Amara. I didn't call her, Amara said. She's at work. She has 2 shifts today. She knows what's happening. The school called her, but she can't leave until her supervisor lets her go. Amara's pencil moved in a small absent circle on the corner of the page. She's going to be worried. She always gets worried. She paused. She works really hard so I can go here. I don't want her to have to leave work and lose her pay because of something I didn't do wrong. Daniel watched her for a moment. You know it's not your fault, he said. Whatever they're sorting out inside, it's nothing you did. She looked at him. I know, she said, with a certainty that surprised him. I just don't understand it. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A preliminary message from his assistant, just the first layer of what they'd found, but it was enough to make something sharpen behind his eyes. He typed back, keep going. Specifically look at donor-linked conditions on admissions. And find out who Evelyn Harrington is. He stood up. I'm going back inside to speak with the principal again, he told Amara. And I'm going to make sure you get a class today. She looked up at him with the careful expression of a child who has learned not to rely too heavily on promises made by adults she doesn't know. You don't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. But no child should sit outside while everyone else is learning. He walked back through the front doors, and this time when the staff saw him coming, something in his manner had shifted. There was a quietness to it that was different from the quietness of a polite visitor. It was the quietness of someone who had decided something. Within 20 minutes, Daniel's assistant had confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The scholarship program was not merely under political pressure. It was being quietly dismantled. Amara Johnson was not an isolated case. She was the first visible one. And buried in the school's board communications was a name that kept appearing. Evelyn Harrington. A real estate developer. A major donor. A woman whose son had recently lost a prestigious academic award to a scholarship student. To Amara Johnson. Daniel stood in the corridor outside Whitaker's office, reading the summary on his phone, and felt something settle in a place in his chest. The particular stillness that came when a situation clarified itself completely, when what had looked like an unfortunate administrative incident revealed itself to be something else entirely. This wasn't paperwork. This was power being used against a child. He knocked on the office door, stepped inside, and began asking the questions that would change everything. The hallway outside Principal Whitaker's office smelled like floor wax and old coffee, and Amara had been sitting in it for 20 minutes now. Someone, one of the junior administrative staff, a young woman named Ms. Briggs who had the look of a person perpetually apologizing for things that weren't her fault, had finally come outside and told Amara she could wait inside the building, at least. She'd been shown to a row of padded chairs against the wall opposite the main office window, chairs that were meant for parents waiting on appointments, and she had settled into one with her backpack on her lap and her notebook open on top of the backpack. She was still working on the same sequence problem. The hallway had its own sound, the distant blur of classroom activity leaking under closed doors, the occasional click of heels on linoleum, the low murmur of adult conversations happening just out of earshot. Amara could hear, if she concentrated, the specific sounds of third period beginning down the hall. The rattle of the science room cart being wheeled out. Mrs. Clark's voice carrying a greeting that Amara recognized, even muffled by distance and walls. She did not look up from her notebook when she heard it, but her pencil paused for a moment before continuing. Down the corridor, out of sight, Daniel Carter was seated across from Principal Whitaker again. This time the conversation had a different quality. The careful dance of the first meeting had been replaced by something more direct, and Whitaker had the expression of a man who had realized, too slowly, that the visitor across from him was not who he had assumed. Daniel's assistant had sent 3 separate messages in the last 30 minutes. Daniel had read each one with a particular focused attention of someone processing information in real time, and what the messages contained had solidified something that had been forming since the moment he'd watched Amara wipe her eyes on the front steps. "Walk me through the board structure," Daniel said. "Who are the voting members with direct donor relationships?" Whitaker shifted. "That's somewhat outside the scope of what I thought today's conversation would cover. Humor me." The principal folded his hands and recited the composition of the board with the careful, measured tone of someone deciding which details to volunteer and which to withhold. 12 voting members. 7 were parent representatives. 5 were community and donor affiliates. Of those 5 affiliates, 2 had direct financial relationships with the school that went beyond standard donation. They had, in Whitaker's delicate phrasing, structured giving arrangements. Meaning their donations came with conditions, Daniel said. Whitaker didn't answer directly. He looked at the middle distance and said, "Philanthropic relationships with institutions are often complex. One of those structured arrangements involves Evelyn Harrington." The pause before Whitaker's response lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Mrs. Harrington is one of the school's most significant long-term supporters. Her giving is conditional on admissions policy." "I wouldn't characterize it quite so." "How would you characterize it?" Whitaker turned slightly in his chair. Outside his window, the school's back courtyard sat empty in the gray morning light. Clean and well-maintained, the kind of courtyard that appeared in the school's promotional materials. He looked at it for a moment. "Mrs. Harrington has expressed strong views about the direction of the school's student profile. She has made clear that her continued support is connected to whether the school shares her vision. And her vision is a school with no scholarship students. Her vision," Whitaker said carefully, "is a school that maintains what she calls academic and social consistency." Daniel looked at him. "Her son lost an academic award to Amara Johnson," he said. It was not a question. His assistant had confirmed it in the second message. "A regional STEM competition 8 weeks ago. Amara had placed first in her age category. Evelyn Harrington's son, Brandon, had placed third." Whitaker said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. "How long has the scholarship elimination plan been in development?" Daniel asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "There's been a board-level discussion about restructuring the financial aid program," Whitaker admitted. "Nothing has been formally decided. But it's far enough along that Amara Johnson was denied entry to school this morning." That was, Whitaker stopped. Started again. "There was communication sent to the family regarding a documentation review. Did the family receive that communication in enough time to address it?" A third pause. Whitaker picked up his pen and set it down. "The letter went out last Thursday," he said, "for a Monday enrollment hold." Silence. "On a scholarship student," Daniel continued, "whose mother works double shifts at a hospital and can't access administrative offices during working hours." Whitaker looked at his desk. Whatever version of this conversation he had rehearsed in the 5 minutes between Daniel's first visit and his return, it had not prepared him for this particular quality of quiet persistence, the kind that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. "I want to understand something," Daniel said. "The board meeting's scheduled for this afternoon. Does Evelyn Harrington typically attend?" "She attends most board meetings, yes. In an advisory capacity." "Will she be there today?" "I believe so." Daniel nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "I'll look forward to speaking with her." Amara heard the door before she saw it open. She looked up from her notebook as Daniel stepped back into the hallway, and something in the steadiness of his expression, not a smile exactly, but a certain settledness, made the tight coil of tension in her chest loosen very slightly. He came and sat in the chair beside her rather than standing over her, which she had noticed he always did. Most adults stood when they spoke to children. This man sat down. "They're going to let you back in class," he said. She searched his face. Today. She exhaled. It was a small, quiet exhalation. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the simple release of something that had been held too long. "What was wrong with my paperwork?" she asked. Daniel considered his answer for a moment. "It's complicated," he said, "but the short version is that it wasn't really about your paperwork." She looked at him steadily. She was 8 years old, and she processed things the way people who are very intelligent and very observant often do. quickly, and with an accuracy that could be disconcerting. "Is it because of the scholarship?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "My mom told me some people at the school didn't want the scholarship kids here," Amara said. Her voice was completely matter-of-fact. She said like she was warning me. "She said some people like to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere, but the way to answer them is to be so good at what you do that they can't pretend you're not there." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Your mother sounds like a wise person," he said. "She is," Amara said simply. "She's the smartest person I know. She just didn't get the same opportunities I'm getting." Down the hall, Mrs. Clark's classroom door opened, and a student emerged carrying a bathroom pass. The sound of the lesson leaked out briefly, something about force and load distribution, before the door swung shut again. Amara's eyes went to the door and stayed there for a second. "Go to class," Daniel said. "I'll handle what needs to be handled." She stood up, packed her notebook carefully into her backpack, and straightened her uniform. Then she looked at him with that direct, measuring expression. "Are you someone important?" she asked. "You seem like someone important." "Not particularly," he said. She looked unconvinced but didn't push it. "Thank you," she said. It came out formal and genuine at the same time, the way children say thank you when they really mean it. She walked down the hallway toward class. He watched her go. Then he took out his phone and called his assistant back. Evelyn Harrington arrived at Ridgewood Academy at 2:15 in the afternoon in a white Mercedes that she parked in the no-parking zone by the front entrance because the staff had apparently never found a way to tell her not to. She was 51 years old, expensively maintained, and carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had learned early that money, deployed correctly, dissolved most obstacles before they became inconvenient. She was not expecting trouble today. She was attending a routine board meeting, one that happened to coincide with a preliminary conversation about a potential large donation. She had already briefed two of her aligned board members on how to handle the donation discussion strategically, ensuring that any funds coming in would be directed toward programs that supported her vision for the school rather than the scholarship initiatives she'd spent the last several months quietly working to dismantle. She had, she believed, managed the situation with Amara Johnson efficiently. The letter had gone out. The enrollment hold was in place. By the time the family gathered the required documentation, if they ever did, the board would have voted to formally restructure the program, and the whole business would be settled. She did not yet know that Amara had been back in class since 10:30 that morning. She also did not yet know that the man sitting quietly in the conference room at the end of the administrative wing, reviewing notes on his phone, had spent the last 4 hours learning everything there was to know about Ridgewood Academy's financial structure, its donor relationships, and the specific contractual language in Evelyn Harrington's giving agreement. She found out about Lena Johnson first. She was walking through the front office when she saw her, a woman in a hospital janitorial uniform, still wearing the badge from her shift, sitting very upright in one of the waiting chairs with her hands folded in her lap. She had the look of someone who had come as fast as she could from somewhere she couldn't really afford to leave. Her eyes had the particular quality of a mother who has been afraid for several hours and is still afraid. Evelyn glanced at her, registered what she represented, and looked away. Ms. Briggs, the junior staff member, intercepted Evelyn with a message that Principal Whitaker wanted to speak with her before the board meeting. Evelyn followed her without concern, smoothing the front of her jacket as she walked. Lena Johnson had arrived at 1:45. She had been allowed to leave her second shift early only because she'd explained that her daughter had been prevented from entering school, and she didn't fully understand why. Her supervisor, a tired woman who had worked hospital administration for 30 years and had very little patience for things that didn't make sense, had looked at the situation and said, "Go, but clock out." So Lena had clocked out, still in her uniform because there was no time to change, and had taken 2 buses and then walked the last 6 blocks because waiting for the 3rd bus would have taken longer. She was 41 years old, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than a double shift. She was tired the way you get when you've been doing everything right for years and still find yourself sitting in a private school waiting room in a janitorial uniform asking why your daughter had been left outside in the cold. She had been told by Ms. Briggs that the matter was under review and that a gentleman was also on site who had apparently been involved in the morning's events. She had not been told who this gentleman was. She had been asked to wait. So she waited. Daniel found her there at 2:20, just as the board members were beginning to arrive for the afternoon meeting. He introduced himself simply. First name, no title, and sat down across from her. For a few minutes, they just talked. She told him what had happened from her side. The letter on Thursday. Coming home from her shift to find it on the kitchen table where Amara had left it, weighted down with a spoon so it wouldn't blow off. Reading the phrases enrollment, compliance review, and documentation requirements, and feeling her stomach drop. Spending most of Friday on the phone with the school office, being transferred 3 times, finally being told by someone she couldn't get the name of that it would likely be resolved by early next week. I sent Amara this morning because she wanted to go, Lena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't entirely. She said, Mom, I'm not going to miss the 3D printer session over a letter. And I thought, if the school has an issue, they'll tell us when we get there. We'll sort it out at the front desk. She looked at her hands. I didn't think they'd leave her on the steps. She handled it with remarkable composure, Daniel said. Lena looked at him. She always does, she said. That's the part that breaks my heart. She's 8 years old, and she already knows how to hold herself together when things aren't fair, because she's learned that falling apart doesn't help. Daniel was quiet for a moment. She told me she wants to be a structural engineer. For the first time since she'd arrived, Lena's face opened slightly, a softness replacing the controlled anxiety. Since she was 5, she said, she used to build these little structures out of cardboard tubes and tape, and then figure out how much weight they could hold before they collapsed. She kept a notebook. She paused. She still keeps a notebook. I saw it, Daniel said. The conference room at the end of Ridgewood's administrative wing was a room designed for impressions. Long mahogany table, 12 leather chairs, framed photographs of notable alumni on the walls, a view of the school's main courtyard through floor-to-ceiling windows. It had hosted fundraising announcements and capital campaigns, and the particular kind of conversations where large sums of money were discussed in very low voices. The 7 board members who had assembled by 2:45 were in various states of preparation. 3 of them had been briefed by Evelyn. 2 had heard pieces of the morning story through staff channels and were uncertain. 2 were new enough to the board that they were mostly watching others for cues. Whitaker opened the meeting with his usual practice smoothness, noting the agenda items and acknowledging the presence of Daniel Carter as a prospective foundation partner. Several board members smiled at Daniel with the particular warmth of people who understand that he represented a significant sum of money. Daniel smiled back, pleasantly. Evelyn Harrington sat 3 chairs down from Whitaker's right hand, composed and still, wearing the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion before the meeting started. She glanced at Daniel with a measured assessment, placing him, categorizing him, deciding how he fit into the room, and then looked back at Whitaker as he continued his opening remarks. She had heard about the morning, of course. Whitaker had given her a quick summary in their brief pre-meeting conversation, framed carefully. There was a situation with one of the scholarship students, a visitor got involved, it's been resolved, and she had accepted the summary without apparent concern. These things happened. They were managed. That was what administrative staff were for. She did not yet understand what resolved meant in this context. Before we moved to the agenda, Daniel said, when Whitaker paused for breath. His voice was quiet and easy, the voice of someone comfortable speaking in rooms like this. I'd like to ask the board a question. Whitaker gestured his assent, assuming this would be a preliminary comment about the donation initiative. Why was an 8-year-old child forced to sit outside your school for 3 hours this morning? The room went still. Not dramatically still. Not the sudden silence of shocking announcement. More like the stillness of a room recalibrating, the specific hush of people realizing simultaneously that the conversation they had prepared for was not the conversation that was about to happen. Evelyn's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. 2 of the board members looked at each other. One looked at Whitaker. Whitaker looked at the table. That situation, Evelyn said, her voice smooth and measured, was an administrative matter involving enrollment compliance. The school has standards it's obligated to uphold, and when documentation is incomplete, there are procedures. She's been enrolled here all year. Daniel said. The documentation issue arose recently. A letter was sent Thursday afternoon for a Monday hold, Daniel said, to a family where the mother works 2 shifts at a hospital and doesn't have weekday access to administrative offices. He said it not with heat, but with the precision of someone presenting facts that have been arranged carefully and will not be rearranged by spin. The child arrived on time this morning. She had her materials. She was turned away and left outside on the steps. These are standard enrollment procedures. They're not standard, Daniel said. I've reviewed your enrollment compliance documentation. The procedure for scholarship review allows for a minimum 14-day notice period. The letter went out 7 days ago. Silence. One of the newer board members, a man named Stuart Green who ran a city architecture firm and had joined the board 8 months ago, looked at Evelyn with an expression that had some questions in it. I want to understand something, Daniel continued, still in the same quiet, even tone. This school has a scholarship program that was funded, in part, by the original endowment from the school's founders. That program has been operational for 11 years. Amara Johnson was admitted to it after scoring in the top 0.5% on academic placement testing. She is, by every measure, one of the most academically gifted students currently enrolled. He paused. And this morning, she sat on your front steps for 3 hours, trying not to cry, doing math homework from a notebook so she wouldn't fall behind in a class she wasn't being allowed to attend. The room held its silence. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, I respect your perspective, but you're new to this community and to this institution. The decisions we make here reflect the values and expectations of families who have invested significantly in this school's future. Her son placed third, Daniel said. The sentence landed quietly, but it landed completely. Evelyn's expression didn't break, but it went very careful. The particular care of someone recalculating without showing that they're recalculating. In the regional STEM competition, Daniel continued, 8 weeks ago, Amara Johnson placed first. Brandon Harrington placed third. He looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who is not angry, but is also not going to pretend. I'm not suggesting that's the only factor here, but I think this board deserves to have the full picture of what's driving the pressure to remove scholarship students from this school. Evelyn's voice went cooler. That is an outrageous insinuation. You're welcome to respond to it. I don't need to respond to baseless. Your giving agreement with the school, Daniel said, contains language and section for that connects continued annual contributions to admissions profile targets. I have the document. He didn't take it out. He simply stated it. I'd like one of the board's legal representatives to review that language before the end of today's meeting and advise on whether it constitutes appropriate donor conduct. 2 board members looked at Whitaker. Whitaker looked to the table. Stuart Green had stopped pretending to be neutral. Evelyn was quiet for the first time since the meeting had begun. The hallway outside became relevant again about 20 minutes into the meeting when Lena Johnson, who had been waiting with no further update from Ms. Briggs, stood up and walked to the conference room door. She didn't know quite what was happening inside. She knew her daughter had been let back into class, which had been the first piece of good news in an awful day, but she did not know what the meeting was deciding or whether it would stay decided. She knocked once, and the door opened. Whitaker looked at her with the expression of a man who wished the afternoon would simply end. Daniel looked at her and nodded, which she took as a signal that this was all right. She came in and sat in the nearest empty chair and looked around the room at the people in it. Mrs. Johnson, Daniel said. The board was just beginning to discuss the future of Ridgewood's scholarship program. I thought you should be here. Evelyn looked at Lena with an expression that was not quite contempt, but lived in that neighborhood. The reflexive dismissal of someone in a janitorial uniform sitting at a mahogany conference table. She looked away quickly, but not quickly enough. Lena noticed. She noticed everything, the way her daughter noticed everything, because that was where Amara had gotten it from. Daniel saw the look too. He looked at Evelyn for a moment without expression. Then he looked back at the board. I want to be straightforward with everyone in this room, he said. I came to Ridgewood today intending to discuss a $40 million foundation initiative. My team had identified this school as a potential lead partner in a national program for gifted students from underrepresented backgrounds. He paused. I watched this school leave one of those students outside on its front steps. So the conversation has changed. Stuart Green leaned forward. What are you proposing? If Ridgewood is willing to formally protect and expand its scholarship program, with binding policy changes rather than statements of intent, I will still bring the initiative here. The funding, the national recognition, the partnership with university engineering departments that our program involves. Daniel looked around the table. But if this board decides that one donor's preferences are more important than a child's right to learn, I'll take the program to a school that doesn't. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had the quality of arithmetic, people doing calculations quietly behind their faces. Evelyn's voice, when it came, had lost some of its smoothness. You cannot come into this institution for one morning and threaten to dismantle. I'm not dismantling anything, Daniel said. I'm offering a choice. Protect the program and grow with us. Or don't. He looked at her steadily. But if the story of this morning becomes public, and it will because that's how these things work, I want this board to have made a clear decision it can stand behind. Lena had been quiet through most of this. Now she said, not loudly, not with performance, just steadily, my daughter studies every night. She reads ahead in her textbooks. She teaches herself math that isn't in the curriculum because she can't help it. It's just how her mind works. She looked around the room. She wants to be an engineer. She wants to build things that last. And this morning she sat on your steps, and try not to cry because somebody with more money than her didn't want her here. She stopped. Let's sit. I need to know if this school is going to be the kind of place where that can happen again. The board members were quiet. Stuart Green looked at Whitaker. We need to hear from legal about that donor agreement, he said. His voice had the tone of someone who has decided something. Today, Whitaker nodded slowly. Evelyn's jaw was tight. She looked at Daniel with an expression that carried something beyond frustration, a dawning recognition of how the terrain had shifted beneath her. She had walked into this room holding what she believed were all the significant cards, and the cards had turned out to belong to someone else. If you withdraw your funding, Daniel told her quietly, with no satisfaction in it, just a plain statement of fact, I'll replace every dollar. And more. The room was absolutely still. So the question before this board, he said, looking at each of the members in turn, isn't about money. It isn't even really about policy. He settled back slightly. The question is what this school is actually for. And I think everyone in this room, including you, Harold, already knows the answer. You've always known it. Today is just the day someone made you say it out loud. Through the conference room window, in the courtyard below, the end-of-day bell rang. 30 seconds later, students began streaming out of the building into the afternoon, laughing, shouting, chasing each other in that particular release of energy that follows a full day of being required to sit still. In the middle of the flow, unhurried, carrying her backpack on both shoulders with the safety pin still on the right strap, Amara Johnson walked out into the daylight. She stopped on the courtyard steps, the same steps she had sat on that morning, and looked up at the sky for a moment. Then she sat down to wait for her mother. She took out her notebook. The board meeting adjourned at 3:15 without a final vote. It had been Stuart Green who suggested it, quietly, practically, in the tone of someone who understood that decisions made in heated rooms tend to get unmade in calmer ones. We need the legal review first, he said, and enough board members nodded that Whitaker had little choice but to agree. The meeting would reconvene the following morning at 9. Any votes on policy would wait until then. Evelyn Harrington left the conference room without speaking to anyone. Her heels were sharp and deliberate on the linoleum, the sound of someone moving through a space they intend to reclaim. She did not look at Lena as she passed. She did not look at Daniel. She looked straight ahead through the glass front doors to where her white Mercedes sat waiting in the no parking zone with the particular certainty of a vehicle that has never once been ticketed. She was gone before the other board members had finished gathering their things. Daniel watched her go. He had seen this type of exit before. Not defeat, not retreat, but recalibration. The withdrawal of someone who has lost a round and is already thinking about the next one. He had seen it in boardrooms and contract negotiations, and once in a congressional hearing that had not gone the way anyone expected. It always meant the same thing. She wasn't done. He told Lena this quietly, in the hallway, after the room had cleared. Lena was standing with her hands folded, still in her uniform, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the double shift. "She'll try something else," Daniel said. "I want you to be prepared for that." "What kind of something else?" "Rumors. Pressure on other parents. Maybe an emergency donor meeting before tomorrow morning." He paused. "She has relationships in this building that go back years. She knows which staff members are afraid of her and which board members depend on her for referrals." He looked at Lena steadily. "She will use all of it." Lena absorbed this. "And what do we do?" "We show up tomorrow morning and we let the legal review do its work," Daniel said. "And we make sure Amara is in class." Lena looked at him for a moment. This quiet man in the expensive suit who had spent his entire day fighting for her daughter and hadn't once asked for anything in return. She still didn't fully understand who he was or why this had become his cause, but she had stopped needing to understand it in order to be grateful for it. "She's out in the courtyard," Lena said. "She's been waiting for me." "Go," Daniel said. "I'll see you both tomorrow." Evelyn Harrington made 4 phone calls between 3:20 and 4 o'clock. The first was to her attorney, who specialized in institutional contracts, and who listened to Evelyn's summary of the donor agreement question with the careful silence of someone trying to determine how worried to be. He told her he'd review the language tonight and call her back. The second was to a board member named Patricia Goodwin, who had been aligned with Evelyn for 3 years and whose husband's company had a pending contract with Evelyn's real estate firm. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Patricia sounded uncertain at the end of it, but Evelyn was practiced at leaving uncertainty in a state where it would settle in the right direction overnight. The third call was to a parent named Robert Mercer, who sat on the school's parent advisory committee and whose opinion carried weight among the older families. Evelyn framed the situation carefully, a wealthy outsider arriving without invitation and attempting to leverage a personal donation into control over the school's admissions policies. She used the phrase institutional sovereignty twice. Robert Mercer said he'd think about it, which was enough. The fourth call was to a contact at the city's second-largest newspaper, who was not a reporter but knew reporters. Evelyn was careful here. She didn't give details. She asked, in the abstract, whether a story about outside interference in a private school's governance would be interesting to anyone. Her contact said it might depend on who the outsider was. Evelyn said she'd follow up. What she didn't know, while she was making these calls, was that something had already been set in motion inside the school that she couldn't reverse. The teacher's lounge at Ridgewood was a small room off the second-floor corridor that smelled like burnt coffee and whiteboard marker and the particular staleness of a space where people eat lunch quickly over conversations they don't have time to finish. At 4:15, when the students were gone and the administrative staff were beginning to close up for the day, teachers gathered in it. Mrs. Patricia Clark had taught 3rd grade at Ridgewood for 9 years. She was 53, methodical, and had the kind of institutional loyalty that was real, but conditional. She loved the school the way you love something you've invested years in, but not so much that she pretended it hadn't done something wrong. She had watched Amara Johnson arrive that morning. She had been told not to interfere. She had spent the next 7 hours being professionally furious about those two things existing simultaneously. Around the table with her were 2 other teachers, James Fowler from 4th grade and Sandra Webb, who ran the science program, and Ms. Briggs, the junior administrative staff member who had been quietly miserable all day. "I want to know what's happening tomorrow," Mrs. Clark said. "The board is reconvening," Ms. Briggs said. She was technically not supposed to share board business, but she had gotten past the point of caring about that particular rule. "There's a legal review of one of the donor agreements." "Evelyn Harrington's," James Fowler said. It was not a question. Ms. Briggs said nothing, which answered it. "She won't let this go quietly," Sandra Webb said. Sandra ran the science lab that Amara loved. She had taught the girl every Thursday for 6 weeks and had already told Mrs. Clark privately that she had never seen a child that age engage with structural concepts the way Amara did. "She'll go after the parents tonight. She'll have half of them convinced by morning that this is about some outsider trying to take over the school. Then we say something before she does," Mrs. Clark said. Say something to who? The other teachers. The parents who aren't in her pocket. She looked around the table. Parents trust teachers. If we make clearly, directly, that Amara Johnson is one of the most gifted students this school has ever had, and that what happened this morning was wrong, some of those parents will listen. She paused. This school has been good. It has been genuinely good for most of its history. I am not willing to let one donor's grudge rewrite what this place is. James Fowler nodded slowly. Sandra Webb looked at her coffee cup and then back up. Ms. Briggs looked at the table and then said, very quietly, Amara brought homework. She sat on those steps for almost an hour before anyone let her inside, and she brought homework so she wouldn't fall behind. She stopped. She's 8 years old. The table was quiet for a moment. Then we say something, Sandra Webb said. Daniel did not go back to his hotel that evening. He sat in his car for a while after the school emptied out, reading through the full document package his assistant had compiled over the course of the day. It was comprehensive, 3 years of board meeting minutes, the financial records showing the structure of Evelyn's conditional giving, the admissions data for the last 4 scholarship cycles, and at the bottom of the stack, a set of internal communications that his team had obtained through a public records request that the school apparently hadn't anticipated. The communications were between Whitaker and 2 board members. They dated back 7 months. They discussed, in the careful passive voice of people who know they're writing something that could be read later, the goal of reducing the scholarship cohort to 0 within 2 academic years. Amara had been one of 11 scholarship students currently enrolled. The plan, such as it was, had been to let enrollments lapse quietly, using compliance reviews and documentation requirements and the administrative friction that comes naturally to institutions when they want something to happen without anyone having to say directly that they want it to happen. Daniel read the communications twice. Then he put down his phone and looked out the window at the school's iron gates, which were closed now, the building silent and dark except for a light in the second-floor corridor. He thought about what Amara had said. Learning shouldn't depend on how rich your parents are. She hadn't said it to him. She had said it to herself, mostly out there on the steps before she'd known he was watching. A small, honest observation from a child who had spent the morning discovering something unfair about the world and had arrived at the essential principle of it with the directness of someone who doesn't yet know they're supposed to soften these things. He thought about something else. Something that had been sitting at the edge of his attention since Lena had mentioned it in that brief hallway conversation before the board meeting. A name she'd said while explaining Amara's love of engineering. A man who had also loved mathematics, who had also kept notebooks. Daniel picked up his phone and sent a message to his assistant. Marcus Johnson, engineer, worked for Carter Technologies 2009 to 2011. I need everything. The response came at 6:47 in the morning. Daniel was already awake. He was almost always awake before 6, a habit from years when being up early was less a choice than a survival strategy. He was sitting at the desk in his hotel room with coffee and the internal quiet of someone who slept lightly and thought heavily. And when his phone lit up with a message from his assistant, he read it twice before setting the phone down and sitting still for a long time. Marcus Johnson, born 1979, Detroit. Mathematics degree from a state university in Michigan, obtained on a partial scholarship. Joined Carter Technologies in 2009 as a junior software engineer. Promoted within 14 months to the advanced systems team, the fastest internal promotion in the company's history at that point. Assigned to the development of the load distribution algorithm that would eventually become the core of the company's infrastructure optimization product. That product had launched in 2011 and had been the revenue engine that allowed Carter Technologies to scale from a mid-sized regional firm to a national operation within 3 years. Marcus Johnson had died in May 2011. A structural failure in the building where the advanced systems team had temporarily relocated during an office renovation. A ceiling collapse in a server room. Marcus had been working late. He was the only person in the building at the time. He was 32 years old. He left behind a wife named Lena and a daughter who had not yet been born. Daniel put down his coffee cup. He had known Marcus Johnson. Not well. In 2011, Daniel's company had employed 300 people, and he had been simultaneously managing a funding round, 2 product launches, and a lawsuit from a competitor. Marcus had been brilliant and quiet and easy to overlook in the day-to-day chaos of a growing company. The way people who do foundational work often are, essential and invisible at the same time. Daniel had attended the funeral. He had signed a condolence card that his assistant had drafted. He had approved the settlement that the company's lawyers had arranged with Lena, who was newly widowed and pregnant and who had, the lawyers told him, accepted the terms without fighting them because she didn't have the resources to fight and because she just wanted it over. Daniel had not thought about Marcus Johnson in years. Not deliberately. It was more that the pace of everything had simply carried him forward. The way momentum carries you past things you mean to stop and examine, but don't. He was thinking about Marcus Johnson now. He was thinking about the load distribution algorithm that Marcus had developed in a rented office on the 4th floor of a building on Clement Street. In a room full of takeout containers and whiteboard equations, in the months before the company had real office space or real money. The algorithm that made everything else possible. The algorithm that, to be honest with himself, he had never adequately credited publicly. Not because he had tried to hide it, but because companies in growth mode don't stop to properly document the foundational contributions of junior engineers, and because Marcus hadn't been there afterward to remind anyone. He thought about Amara Johnson on the steps. Her notebook, the sequence problem she'd constructed from a simpler one, because she couldn't help making things more complex and interesting, because that was simply how her mind worked. She loved solving complex puzzles, Amara had told him. I want to be an engineer someday. He thought about Lena Johnson in her janitorial uniform at the mahogany table, saying, she can't help it. It's just how her mind works. He picked up the phone again. Where did Lena Johnson go after the settlement? What happened to the family? The second message came back within the hour. Lena had moved twice, first to her sister's apartment in another city, then back to the city 2 years later when the sister moved away. She had been working hospital support jobs for the last 6 years. She had, in the period immediately after Marcus's death, attempted to enroll in an evening nursing program, but dropped out after 1 semester because of childcare costs. She had never pursued legal action beyond the initial settlement. Daniel read the message and thought for a while about the word settlement, about what it meant when a company's lawyers arranged one quickly with a grieving widow who was pregnant and had no resources to hire her own legal team, about what accepting the terms looked like from inside that apartment in the aftermath of a loss that was sudden and total and left you with a baby coming and no income and a settlement figure that the lawyers had presented as generous because there was no one in the room to tell you it wasn't. He called his personal attorney at 7:15. The call lasted 22 minutes. He called Lena at 8 o'clock. He had her number from the school's emergency contact form, which Ms. Briggs had provided the previous afternoon. He introduced himself fully this time. Not just Daniel, but Daniel Carter, Carter Technologies, and he heard the small pause on her end that meant she was placing the name. I need to speak with you in person before the board meeting, he said. Are you able to come to the school early? I can arrange for Amara to be received by Mrs. Clark directly. Another pause. What's this about? Lena asked. It's about Amara, he said, and about something I should have done years ago. They met in a small room off the main corridor. Not the principal's office, not the conference room, just a quiet space with 2 chairs and a table that was normally used for parent-teacher conferences. Lena arrived at 8:20. She had slept, but not well. She was not in her uniform today, a dark green sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back, and she looked more like herself than she had the previous afternoon, which made the conversation both easier and harder. Daniel told her about Marcus. He told her all of it, the algorithm, what it had meant for the company, the growth that it had enabled. He told her about the accident and how he had processed it at the time, which was inadequately, and why, which was the honest and uncomfortable reason of someone who had been moving too fast to stop. He told her about the settlement, and what he now understood about the conditions under which she had accepted it. He did not try to excuse any of it. He stated it plainly, the way Marcus had always solved problems. No unnecessary decoration, just the structure of the thing laid out clearly. Lena was quiet through most of it. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she listened with the particular quality of someone receiving information they need to hold carefully because it changes the shape of something they have been carrying for a long time. When he finished, she was still for a moment. Then, you knew him. I knew his work better than I knew him, Daniel said. And I should have known him better. She looked at the table. He talked about the company like it was going to change everything, she said. He was so excited about what they were building. He used to come home and explain the problems to me. I didn't always follow the math, but I loved listening to him. She stopped. He was so sure it was going to matter. It did matter, Daniel said. More than we ever publicly acknowledged. Lena looked at him. Her eyes were bright, but she wasn't crying. She had the contained quality of someone who had processed grief so many times and in so many ways that it no longer broke open, just moved through her like weather. What are you telling me? She asked. I'm telling you that Carter Technologies owes Marcus Johnson a debt that it never properly repaid, Daniel said, and that Amara is carrying her father's gift in that notebook she never puts down, and I intend to make sure she has every possible resource to develop it. He paused. I want to establish a permanent scholarship in Marcus's name, not just here, nationally, for gifted students in engineering and mathematics who come from families without financial means. He looked at her directly, and I want to talk to my legal team about revisiting the settlement. The original terms were not fair, and you signed them under circumstances that didn't give you real choice. The room was very quiet. Lena looked at her hands for a long time. When she looked up, something in her expression had shifted, not relief exactly, and not joy, but the particular quality of a weight that has been carried so long it had stopped feeling like a weight and had started feeling like just the shape of things, and then someone pointed at it and said that shouldn't be there, and the recognition of that was its own complicated thing. Does Amara know? She asked. About her father in your company? Not yet, Daniel said. That's your decision. When and how she learns that is entirely yours. Lena nodded slowly. She knows he was a mathematician, she said. She knows he was brilliant. I've always told her that. A pause. I never told her about the settlement because I never wanted her to feel like the thing that came from his death was money that wasn't enough. She looked at the window. I wanted her to know him through the work, through what he loved. She does, Daniel said. She absolutely does. Outside, the school was filling up. Parents arriving for drop-off. Teachers gathering in the corridor before the first bell. The quiet infrastructure of a school morning. Lunchboxes and forgotten permission slips, and children who ran when they weren't supposed to run and slowed to a walk the moment a teacher appeared. Amara walked through the front gates at 8:35 with her backpack on both shoulders and her notebook tucked under one arm. She had a new pencil, freshly sharpened, the eraser still intact, tucked behind her ear. Mrs. Clark was waiting near the entrance, which was not her usual post, and when Amara saw her, she stopped. Good morning, Amara, Mrs. Clark said. Good morning. How are you doing today? Amara considered the question with her usual care. Better than yesterday, she said. Mrs. Clark smiled. Come on in. We have a full Thursday session. The engineers are in today. She held the door, and the 3D printer is already loaded. I asked Mr. Fowler to set it up first thing. Amara's face did the thing that 8-year-old faces do when something they have been wanting very specifically becomes suddenly available. A brief, bright, entirely unguarded expression of joy before composure reasserted itself. The suspension bridge model? She asked. The suspension bridge model, Mrs. Clark confirmed. Amara walked through the door. The board meeting reconvened at 9. The school's legal advisor, a thin, careful man named Arthur Brennan, who had held the position for 7 years, presented his review of the Harrington donor agreement in the measured tones of someone delivering a diagnosis he wishes were different. The conditional language in Section 4 was, in his professional assessment, inconsistent with the school's own charter, which explicitly prohibited donor influence over admissions decisions. The agreement, as structured, was void on its face, which meant that Evelyn Harrington's contributions, framed as they were around admissions outcomes, had been accepted on terms the school was never legally permitted to agree to. The room was silent while he finished. Evelyn sat very still. She had come prepared for a fight about values and reputation and institutional direction. She had not come prepared for a legal finding. These were different things, and she understood immediately that the terrain had shifted in a way she couldn't simply argue past. This will need to go to the full board for formal review, Arthur Brennan said. But my recommendation is that the conditional language be severed immediately and that the school's admissions policies be formally reaffirmed in writing. Stuart Green said, I'll second that recommendation. Daniel was sitting at the far end of the table. He had not spoken yet. He looked at Evelyn across the length of the mahogany surface and said, simply and without hostility, the scholarship program. Will the board protect it? Evelyn looked at the table. She looked at the two board members she had called the previous evening, Patricia Goodwin, who was studying the legal summary with great concentration, and one other who had suddenly become interested in his own hands. She looked at Stuart Green, who looked back at her without apology. She had 4 decades of knowing which rooms she controlled and which ones had slipped away from her. This one had slipped. She said nothing. I'd like to propose a formal motion, Daniel said, addressing Whitaker. That Ridgewood Academy's scholarship program be permanently protected under the school charter, with enrollment targets no less than current levels, and that no donor agreement be permitted to contain admissions-related conditions going forward. Whitaker looked around the table. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was still looking at the table. He called the vote. It passed 7-1. Evelyn Harrington's was the single dissenting vote, delivered in silence, without a word spoken. She stood up, picked up her portfolio, and walked out of the room. This exit was quieter than the one the day before. It had the quality of a final thing rather than a temporary one. Daniel looked at Lena, who had been sitting just inside the door. She was not smiling exactly, but her eyes were the eyes of someone who has just watched something complicated resolve into something simple and true, and is taking a moment to let that be real before the next thing begins. Thank you, she said to Daniel. It's a start, he said. The program's protected. The rest of it is going to take time. I know about taking time, Lena said. Down the hall, in the science room, the sound of the 3D printer beginning its work was barely audible, a soft mechanical hum, purposeful and steady, building something small and precise and meant to last. The story broke on a Thursday. It wasn't the story Evelyn Harrington had been trying to plant. Her contact at the newspaper had made a few calls, asked a few questions, and then, as these things sometimes go, the questions had led somewhere entirely different from where Evelyn had intended. A source inside the school, identity protected, had described not an outsider interfering with governance, but something much simpler and much more damaging. A private school leaving a scholarship child outside on its steps while her classmates attended class. The headline read, Ridgewood Academy under fire after gifted 8-year-old denied entry while wealthy classmates walked past. By 9 in the morning, it had been shared 1,100 times. By noon, 2 television stations had sent crews to film the school's exterior. By 3 o'clock, the story had been picked up by a national education news outlet, and the comments were running 300-1 in the direction of outrage. Evelyn Harrington had been trying to start a fire pointing one way. The wind had carried it somewhere else entirely. Principal Whitaker called an emergency staff meeting at 7:30 that morning before students arrived. He stood at the front of the faculty room, looking like a man who had not slept and had recently been on several phone calls he hadn't enjoyed, and he said, with a directness that was new for him, I want everyone to know that the school's position, as of this week's board vote, is that the scholarship program is protected and that what happened Monday morning should not have happened. That is the official position, and it is also my personal one. Mrs. Clark, sitting in the third row, looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, which was her version of acceptance. James Fowler had already spoken to 2 parents that morning. One's Evelyn had apparently contacted 2 nights ago, and both of them had called him back after reading the news story to say they were appalled. One of them, a father named Gregory Booth, whose daughter had been in Amara's class all year, said he intended to write to the board directly. Sandra Webb had been stopped in the parking lot by a reporter who asked if she could comment on Amara Johnson as a student. She had said, on record and without hesitation, Amara Johnson is one of the most naturally gifted students I've taught in 20 years of science education. What happened to her on Monday was a failure of this institution, and I'm glad the board has moved to correct it. The quote ran in the afternoon edition. Daniel had anticipated the media attention. He had not orchestrated it, but he had prepared for it, the way you prepare for weather you can see coming without being able to stop it. He had spoken with his own communications team the previous evening and given them a single instruction. When asked about his involvement, keep it simple, keep it honest, and keep the focus on the scholarship program rather than on him personally. He had also made a decision overnight about Marcus Johnson. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything that mattered, at length, in quiet, without rushing to a conclusion. He had considered whether making the story public was the right thing or whether it was the kind of gesture that looked like generosity but was actually about managing his own conscience. He had sat with that question honestly, because he had learned over the years that the difference between those two things was important and not always easy to see. In the end, he had called Lena. "I want to tell people about Marcus," he said, "about what he contributed and what was owed to him, but not without your permission, not without your guidance on how and what." Lena had been quiet for a moment. Then, "He deserved to be known," she said. "He deserved it then, and he deserves it now. Tell the truth about what he built." "I will," Daniel said. "And Daniel," a pause, "tell it like he was a man, not like he was a symbol. He liked bad science fiction movies, and he burned everything he cooked, and he used to read Amara engineering textbooks as bedtime stories even before she could understand them." Another pause. "Tell it like that." "I will try," Daniel said. The public meeting was held at Ridgewood that evening. It had been arranged hastily. The school's auditorium, folding chairs, a microphone at the front, and it filled up in a way that Tuesday's board meeting had not. Parents who had been silent were no longer silent. Teachers who had spent years being careful were done being careful. 3 school board members attended. Whitaker sat in the front row looking like a man who had accepted that tonight was not about him and was trying to be acceptable with that. Evelyn Harrington did not attend. Lena spoke first. She stood at the microphone in the dark green sweater she'd worn to the school that morning, and she spoke for 6 minutes without notes. She talked about Marcus, how he had grown up with nothing and built everything he had from mathematics and stubbornness and a genuine belief that intelligence was the one thing nobody could take from you. She talked about the years after his death, the small apartment, the double shifts, the evening nursing program she'd had to leave. She talked about Amara's first time in a school science lab, how she had come home and sat at the kitchen table and drawn diagrams for 2 hours straight, explaining to her mother every piece of equipment she'd seen. She talked about Monday morning. "My daughter sat on those steps," she said, "and she didn't call me because she didn't want me to lose a half-day's pay. She's 8 years old, and she was protecting me." She stopped, steadied herself. No child should have to do that. No child should have to decide that her education is a luxury her family can't afford to defend. The auditorium was absolutely still. Daniel spoke second. He spoke about Marcus Johnson, the algorithm, the work, the brilliance that had been foundational and under-celebrated. He said the name clearly and without qualification. Marcus Johnson built something that mattered, and Carter Technologies owes him an accounting that it never gave. He said this into a microphone in a school auditorium full of parents and teachers and reporters, and he said it knowing it would be quoted and knowing that was right. He announced the Marcus Johnson Scholars Program, national in scope, partnered with 7 universities, focused on mathematics and engineering, with special priority given to students from lower-income households who demonstrated exceptional aptitude, funded permanently from his foundation, with a governance structure that prevented any single donor from attaching conditions to student selection. The first cohort would begin the following academic year. Ridgewood Academy would be the program's founding school. Marcus Johnson's daughter, Daniel said, is sitting in the 3rd grade at this school. She builds things out of imagination and logic and the specific kind of stubbornness that gifted children have when the world hasn't yet managed to convince them that their ideas are too big. He paused. "She told me that learning shouldn't depend on how rich your parents are. She said it simply, the way people say true things. I want this program to prove her right." There was a silence. Then the kind of applause that isn't polite, the kind that comes from somewhere underneath the social obligation to clap. The reporter who had filed the original story asked Amara a question during the brief open portion at the end of the evening. She had been sitting beside her mother, small and composed, and when the reporter crouched down and said, gently, not performing, "Why do you want to stay at this school?" she thought about it for a moment. Then she said, because learning shouldn't depend on how rich your parents are. The reporter wrote it down. It ran as the final line of the next morning's story, under a photograph of Amara standing in front of Ridgewood's iron gates. She was wearing her Navy uniform. Her backpack was on both shoulders. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not defiant and not pleading, just clear, the way things look when they have been decided. The story was shared 40,000 times by noon. 3 days after the public meeting, Evelyn Harrington resigned from Ridgewood's board. The statement was brief and managed by her attorney. A mutual decision, different directions, grateful for years of service. It did not mention Monday morning or scholarship programs or the legal finding about conditional donor agreements. It was the kind of statement written entirely to say nothing while appearing to say something gracious, and nobody was fooled by it, but nobody needed to be. Her company's development projects in the city's northern district faced 3 separate planning commission reviews the following month, 2 of which resulted in modification requirements that her attorneys described privately as unusual in their specificity. Her photograph disappeared from the school's donor wall. Parents who had been aligned with her stopped being aligned with her in the quiet, total way that social gravity shifts when the center of it is removed. She did not disappear. People with that kind of money and that kind of network rarely disappear entirely. But she became smaller, which was its own kind of consequence. The particular reduction that happens when the room you walk into no longer adjusts itself around you. The morning after the board vote and the public meeting, Amara walked through the front gates of Ridgewood Academy at the same time she always did. The difference was in what she walked into. Mrs. Clark was at the entrance, not because she had been assigned there, but because she had chosen to be. She smiled at Amara in a way that was different from the careful professional warmth of before. It was the smile of someone who had made a decision to be fully on a child's side and felt clear about it. 2 other students from Amara's class, a girl named Sophie Garrett and a boy named Kevin Miles, were waiting near the courtyard with the specific social energy of children who have overheard adult conversations and processed them into something simpler and more direct. "My mom says you're really smart," Sophie said. "I know," Amara said, which made Kevin laugh, and then Sophie laugh, and then the 3 of them walked into the building together. The immediate practical changes at Ridgewood happened over the following weeks rather than overnight, which was how real change worked. Not as a single dramatic transformation, but as a series of smaller adjustments that accumulated into something genuinely different. Arthur Brennan completed the review of all existing donor agreements and identified 2 others with problematic conditional language, both of which were revised. The admissions committee was restructured to include a faculty representative and a community advocate, neither of whom had financial relationships with the school. The scholarship program's enrollment target was formally raised from 11 students to 20, with a commitment to reach 30 within 3 years. Whitaker remained as principal, which some people thought was wrong and some thought was right. He was a different principal after Monday, not transformed exactly, but adjusted like a building that has been through a stress test and knows now where its weak points are. He approved Mrs. Clark's request for an expanded Thursday engineering session. He approved Sandra Webb's proposal for a student research showcase. He stopped taking Patricia Goodwin's calls about admissions preferences. It was not a perfect school. It had never been a perfect school, but it was trying to be a better one, which is the only version of progress that's actually available. Lena Johnson gave her notice at the hospital in October. She had spent 3 weeks being careful about the decision, reading the offer from Daniel's Foundation twice, asking her sister to read it, asking the sort of questions that people ask when something good is happening and they're not entirely sure they are allowed to trust it. The position was in community outreach and education access, working with the Foundation's program team to identify and support scholarship candidates across the city. It paid a real salary, had real hours, and was located 12 minutes from Amara's school. Her last day at the hospital, her supervisor, the tired woman who had sent her home early the day of the board meeting, gave her a card signed by the whole floor and said, without ceremony, "You always work too hard for too little." I'm glad something finally evened out. Lena drove to pick up Amara from school that afternoon and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in a specific way of someone who wants to feel a moment fully before it becomes the past. The light was going gold and amber through the oak trees lining the school's front drive. The iron gates were open. She thought about Marcus. She thought about how he would have walked through those gates, shoulders back, that particular combination of quiet confidence and barely contained excitement that he always had when he was near something he loved. She thought about how he would have looked at Amara, sitting in the science room with her notebook and her pencil and her absolute certainty about bridges. She's going to build things that last, she thought, just like you wanted to. Time moved the way it does when a child is growing, in increments you don't notice individually, but look back on with surprise. The Thursday engineering sessions became the thing Amara talked about most. She developed a habit of leaving small paper models of structures around the apartment. Triangulated frames, arch supports, the beginnings of suspension bridges made from thread and cardboard. Lena stopped throwing them away and started keeping them in a box on the kitchen shelf. Amara read ahead. She always read ahead. By the time she was 10, she was working through middle school mathematics independently. Not because anyone told her to, but because the next problem was always visible just beyond the one she'd solved, and she couldn't help following it. Sandra Webb began giving her access to the school's engineering resource library, textbooks meant for much older students, and Amara consumed them with the focused pleasure of someone reading in their native language. She asked about her father more as she got older. Lena told her carefully, in pieces, in the way you tell a child the true story of something. Not all at once, not in a way that shapes the feeling before the facts have had time to settle. She told her about the mathematics first, about the notebooks Marcus had kept, identical to the ones Amara kept, filled with sequences and structural sketches and the particular shorthand of a person who thinks faster than they write. She told her about the algorithm, what it was, what it did, what it had helped build. She waited until Amara was 11 to tell her about the settlement and the foundation and the full shape of Daniel's connection to their lives. Amara listened the way she listened to complex problems, without interruption, with the kind of stillness that meant deep processing rather than absence. When Lena finished, Amara was quiet for a while. Then she said, "So some of the money that built his company was Dad's?" "Yes," Lena said, "and Daniel is trying to pay it back. In the way that some things can be paid back," Lena said, "and in the way that some things can't be." Amara thought about this. Dad would have liked that, she said finally. Not the money part. The part where something he built kept going. The graduation ceremony at Ridgewood was held on a bright morning in June, the year Amara completed 8th grade and moved on to high school. The auditorium was full, parents and siblings and teachers, and the particular collective warmth of a community that has been through something together and come out knowing each other better than before. The graduating class was small, as Ridgewood's always was, but it included 6 scholarship students, which was new, and the balance of the room felt different for what it had once been, less like a display and more like a gathering. Amara delivered the student address. She stood at the podium in her graduation robe and looked at the audience with the same direct, clear expression she had had at age 8, the one that looked at things the way they were rather than how you wish they were. She was taller now, composed in a way that was earned rather than performed, with her mother's precision and her father's restless intelligence visible in everything about how she held herself. She talked about bridges, not metaphorical bridges, actual ones. She talked about suspension bridges, specifically about the way the load is distributed through the cables to the towers and the anchorages, about how the strength of a suspension bridge comes not from any single element being strong enough to hold everything, but from the whole system sharing the weight. She talked about this for 3 minutes with the ease of someone who has thought about it for years. And the parents who had come expecting a standard graduation speech found themselves actually listening. Then she shifted. "When I was 8 years old," she said, "I sat on the front steps of this school for almost an hour because someone had decided I didn't belong here." She said it plainly, without drama. "I didn't understand it then. I understand it better now. Not because it made sense, but because I've learned that sometimes the thing standing between a person and where they need to be isn't ability. It's just someone else's idea of who deserves to be there." She paused. My father was a mathematician and an engineer. He built something that mattered, and the world didn't give him as much credit for it as it should have. He died before I was born, so I didn't get to learn from him directly. But I learned from his notebooks and from my mother and from every teacher in this building who decided I was worth their time. She looked at Mrs. Clark, who was in the third row, and Mrs. Clark smiled the way she had smiled at the gate on Tuesday morning after the board vote, full and decided. I learned from a man who sat down next to me on cold steps and asked why I wasn't in class, and then actually did something about the answer. In the second row, Daniel Carter was looking at the podium with the expression of someone who is trying to hold something carefully so it doesn't become something smaller than it is. I've been accepted to the Mercer Institute's pre-engineering program, Amara said. It's one of the best science programs in the country for high school students. And I intend to study structural engineering and then civil engineering, and I intend to build things that last. She looked at the audience. My dad built an algorithm that held something up. I want to build bridges that do the same thing, things that carry people from where they are to where they need to be. She looked toward Daniel and her mother, who were sitting 2 seats apart in the second row. One day, I hope to build something that changes the world, she said, just like my dad did. The applause started before she had stepped back from the microphone. Afterward, in the courtyard, in the gold late morning light that came through the oak trees and landed warm on the limestone walls, Lena found Daniel standing slightly apart from the crowd in the way he always stood, present but not performing presence. She's going to be remarkable, he said. She already is, Lena said. He looked at the gates, open as they always were on school days, iron and ordinary in the sunlight. He thought about a Monday morning in October, a black sedan, a small girl with a blue lunchbox sitting on cold steps trying not to cry. He thought about Marcus Johnson in a rented office on Clement Street, filling a whiteboard with equations at midnight, sure that what he was building would matter. He would have been so proud of her, Daniel said. He is, Lena said simply. The way she said things she was certain of. Across the courtyard, Amara was surrounded by her classmates, Sophie Garrett and Kevin Miles and others, laughing, taking photographs, doing the ordinary, beautiful things that young people do at the end of something and the beginning of something else. Her graduation robe was slightly too long, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. She had her notebook tucked under her arm. She looked up once, across the courtyard, and met Daniel's eye. She raised the notebook slightly, a small gesture, almost private, more acknowledgement than wave. He nodded back. The future, already underway, continued. If a child's right to learn can be taken away this easily, what does that say about the world we've built for them? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close because the next story is going to hit just as hard.